Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History with me, Amanda Hallay, and an episode in the little series I have running on this channel called History in Colour, where we look back at the palette of past decades, past centuries, try to figure out why people were so drawn to the colours that they were, what was happening in terms of colour, technologically, artistically, and psychologically, and then try to figure out how it all applied to fashion. And in this episode, I'm really quite excited because we're doing the 1920s, the Jazz Age, and I think I may have inadvertently identified the key fashion colour of the era, and it came as something of a surprise to me, and it might come as a surprise to you. But I'll save that until towards the end of the video to keep you hooked. Anyway, enjoy! Before we start, just to remind you all that I don't do comments here, because if you have a fashion channel, all you get is spam. But you can write to me directly through my website, amandahallay.com, and if you want to comment publicly and start a bit of a chat, you can do so on Facebook. And don't forget, you can always subscribe to the channel at any point during this episode by clicking that little circle you see right down there on the screen to subscribe. I also want to say what a huge debt of gratitude I owe to these two books that I used when researching this particular episode on colour. Colour by Alexandra Losk and Pantone's The 20th Century in Colour. Now, of course, this is the ultimate fashion history, right? But in this series, History in Colour, I really just try to focus on palette. But you know what? I have a ton of episodes on 1920s fashion, like this one. There's a episode on the Weimar Republic. There's a Cultural Connections episode on the Jazz Age. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of 1920s fashion, just do a search in the video section of the Ultimate Fashion History YouTube page. And I also want to say, as you all know, all colours existed at all times. What I'm doing here is really trying to focus in on colours, colour combinations and hues that I really think speak to the Jazz Age. Those of you who have been taught by me in the classroom, and as I've been teaching fashion history for 15 years, that's quite a lot of you now, as well as those of you who regularly watch the channel will know that my catchphrase is fashion is not an island, it's a response. But the same can be said for palette. I really believe that a favoured palette, the favoured colours and colour combinations of an era really do speak to what was happening in the world. So let's look at what was happening in the 1920s to make that decade raw. The First World War had ended in 1918, leaving a terrible legacy of loss that would impact and inform the following decade, a decade that wanted to draw a line in the sand and start the 20th century anew as a truly modern time with bold new ideas in architecture, in art, in literature, in music, in dance, in interior design, at least for some, and for everybody, the movie industry exploded, Hollywood selling a new kind of American dream, a dream very often directed towards the new kind of woman who emerged in the 20s. Throughout the 1920s, women in most of the countries in the Western world gained the right to vote, and this, coupled with a need to fill a workforce depleted by war, gave rise to a truly modern woman, at least modern compared to what went before, and fashion would of course respond to her, as would colour. The concept of colour itself was going through changes and being discussed in a way that set out to demystify it. For example, in Pedro de Lamas's book Applied Art from 1920, it was a sort of do-it-yourself approach to design in which he discusses the harmony of colours and how the teaming of certain hues can alter their appearance. And Michel Jacob's The Art of Colour in 1923 explained how colour reads differently depending on the distance from which it is viewed. So the 1920s was an era when colour itself was a talking point. However, the decade wasn't perhaps as vibrant of hue as we tend to believe. Let me explain what I mean. I think many of us, myself included, tend to think of colours in the Jazz Age as being incredibly vibrant, sort of like the sets and much of the wardrobe in Baz Luhrmann's wonderful Gatsby. However, the truth is a little bit different, especially in terms of the average home, which generally featured a very soft and delicate palette. Bolder hues were added, but in doing my research for this episode, I really came away with the impression that, when it came to colour, the 20s didn't roar quite as much as we might imagine, and this was certainly the case with fashion. I mean, one of the most popular fashion colours of the decade was faded rose. Here's Chanel in 1924, and here are some other gowns, all worked in that soft and dusted rose. These soft and gentle hues really were fashion favourites, and when you see 20s fashion gathered together, like here in this exhibition, you can see that it really wasn't as vibrant and bright as we tend to imagine. In fact, I would say it was a natural continuation from that soft palette favoured of the 1910s, and not so far removed from those muted tones I discuss in the episode of History and Colour on the 1930s. However, bolder colours were appearing, along with some other really interesting palette choices. I mean, take a look at these colour swatches from the decade. You can see these soft tones of lavender and ivory and pink and periwinkle blue and drab competing with these bolder, more exciting and modern hues of vermilion and jade green and crimson. Wow, really exciting 20s colours. So this popping palette that many of us, myself included, associate with the Jazz Age did exist, but it nestled nicely next to a softer, more subdued set of colours that was so popular in the 1910s. That understood, I won't be dwelling too much on that softer palette in this episode, as I'll talk about it in my episode on colour in the 1910s, right? But primary and secondary colours, which hadn't really been used all that much at the start of the century, at least combined together, were appearing with a big, bold bang on the art world. Think Mondrian, think de Stijl, think the new objectivity artists of the Weimar Republic, or those graphically charged Soviet constructivist posters. This was the palette of Bauhaus, primary colours not used in a playful, childlike way like in the 1960s, but speaking to a bold, back-to-basics approach to the concept of modernity. These are the colours of Fortunato de Pero's exciting graphics, of travel posters of the era, and this palette was seen as punchy and exciting, appearing on magazine covers, sheet music, and brand new products of the decade. And although we do see this palette in fashion, as I said, the majority of clothing from the decade was, for the most part, far more subdued. In fact, it is one of these soft hues that I think was the key fashion colour of the decade, but I'll get to that later on. So let's take a look at some individual colours and colour combos that I personally feel marked the decade. And the first is drawn from that primary and secondary colour palette. Yellow. In putting this episode together and looking at graphics and packaging and fashion, I was so surprised at the amount of yellow I came across. It really was a favourite of the decade, and this makes perfect sense. Yellow is a colour charged with energy, and the 1920s was all about energy, right? It's also a really happy colour, and in the wake of World War I, there was quite a need for happiness. And to add the drama of the decade, the teaming of yellow with black was particularly appealing. It's such a bold colour combo, isn't it? And when applied to fashion, it speaks directly to that strong modern woman of the decade. I tend to underplay flappers when I teach the 1920s in class, but this cheeky swimming ensemble with its yellow and black faux dagging certainly says flapper to me. The next quintessentially 1920s colour that I want to talk to you about is black. It's almost impossible to think of Art Deco without thinking of black, especially when teamed with either silver or gold. This was something truly new in architecture. Look at the American Radiator building here. It's now the Bryant Hotel in Manhattan. Built in 1924, this pairing of black with gold was quite a revolution. Yet this strident use of black with metallics became pretty ubiquitous on the design landscape and applied to a lot of interiors and homeware, like with this fabulous screen here, this clock, this packaging. And it was also used a lot in commercial art. Erte, Leyendecker. So elegant, so chic. And also for its time incredibly modern looking. The 20s really was all about modernity, and colour was used to sell this story. And in terms of sartoria, black marked a fashion revolution in the 20s, as it really was the first time that black was truly embraced as a fashion colour, like with Chanel's original little black dress of 1926, because black had previously been associated with mourning and life's more sombre moments. Yet it would suddenly appear on the 20s fashion landscape as a thrillingly daring chic, and of course because it was the 20s modern fashion colour. And when black was teamed with silver or gold, it brought the visual palette of deco architecture and design to a fashion silhouette that was already embracing those clean geometric lines. Black as a fashion colour really was new and exciting, and as I just said, read as incredibly modern. Yet another palette of the 20s was inspired not by the new, but by the very, very old. And I think you all know what I'm going to talk about next. The 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by dashing Howard Carter would have an enormous impact on the 1920s zeitgeist, chiefly due to the riches and treasures found within. This was headline news. Literally, let me zoom this in so you can read it. Tutankhamun's inner tomb is opened, revealing undreamed of splendor still untouched after 3,400 years. And if all this wasn't thrilling enough, the whole curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, also headline news, added to the romance of it all. Everything culminating in an obsession for ancient Egypt that was dubbed Egyptomania, and boy was this a biggie. Egyptomania was everywhere, from architecture and interior design, and of course this was perfect because the geometric forms and blocky art of ancient Egypt lent themselves perfectly to the deco aesthetic, to advertising, to music. Look at these terrific song titles. Old King Tut was a wise old nut, Egyptian Glide, Mummy Mine. To entertainment, and of course fashion would embrace the craze for ancient Egypt as well, and so would hair and makeup. And so, of course, the palette of ancient Egypt, malachite, jasper, calcite, Egyptian blue, gold, eau de Nil, would be applied to everything. It's just amazing how much of the Egyptian palette was applied to 1920s homeware and interiors and dinner services. It's everywhere. And note how often gold is paired with the other hues of ancient Egypt, a direct reference to not only the gold treasures found in Tutankhamun's tomb, but to the decades ever-increasing love of metallic tones. And fashion walked like an Egyptian too in terms of colour in the 20s, with the colours of sarcophagi and tomb art brought to life. These jewel tones worked to great effect in evening wear and often teamed with, yes, gold. Take a look at these. Aren't they gorgeous? But of course, we had already had a little trendy glimpse at this rich jeweled palette in the 1910s, hadn't we? With Paul Poiret and the inspiration that he took from the Ballet Russe. Yet in the 1910s, this rich exotic palette really was generally reserved for the very, very trendy, very fashionable women, with most ladies sticking to that sweeter Edwardian palette of ivory tones and pastels, which did get a little more saturated in the 20s, but was still very much looked to as the idea of exclusively feminine colours to be used for fashion when not in the workplace. And so a dress like this, in this shocking crimson, and I think this is a 1925 Chanel if my memory serves correctly, was quite a departure from the fashion palette of the 1910s. Now, of course, I am generalizing here, but I think you get where I'm going with all this, right? Anyway, the colours of Egypt were joined by another exotic colour combo. that of the peacock. The 20s obsession with peacocks was really just a carry-on from the peacock craze of the 1910s. Think Gloria Swanson or Theda Bara in their peacock get-ups. But peacocks continued to strut into the 20s, appearing on homeware and merchandise, in graphics, in packaging, in posters, in song. Peacocks really were a bit of a trend. And so the palette of the peacock, with its purples and greens and teals, found its place in fashion, speaking as it did to the 20s love of exoticism and far-off climes. And yet, I still don't think that these jewel tones were the fashion colour of the decade. I'll give you my theory on that one towards the end to keep you hooked. But before that, I think it's important, especially in terms of fashion, to remind us all as to just how much brown was around in the 20s. Brown, slate grey, this darker, more practical palette. Of course, we know that Gatsby's pink shirts notwithstanding, brown was the signature colour of 1920s menswear, along with black or navy chalk stripe. But women's wear, especially daywear, was generally made up of browns, dark grey, sage green, this kind of thing. Sombre and sensible tones. Even sometimes in summer, because as we all know, even with the advent of electric washing machines in some people's home, laundering clothes was as much of a hassle in the 20s as it was at the turn of the century, really. And darker colours are far more forgiving and rely upon less laundering. Okay, I will tease you no more. I am going to reveal what I have come to believe was the most popular fashion colour of the Jazz Age. As I was researching this episode, looking through museum collections, looking at colour catalogues, the palette I kept coming across time and time again was this one. Nude, flesh-toned, very pale beige. Time and time again, these flesh-toned neutrals came into play, and it left me wondering why. Well, of course, we tend to call this colour today champagne, and we certainly think of champagne in relation to the endless, soulless party that was the 20s, but I have another theory. Tell me what you think. The 20s was the first time since ancient times that women showed so much skin. They showed their legs, they showed their arms, sometimes they would show them both. And this was incredibly daring and sexy. And by the way, you will all recognise that flapper in the middle, don't you? Of course, it's Joan Crawford. Anyway, I wonder if the popularity of flesh tones in clothing was a means of blurring the visual line between what was flesh and what was fabric, and added to the overarching fashion idea of the female body exposed. The 20s saw the first flutterings of a sexual revolution, and I think that perhaps the idea of clothing that was coloured to intentionally blur the line between what was flesh and what was fabric was considered incredibly sexy, and it was also rather lovely. Look at this dress by Vionnet. This is so wearable today, isn't it? I'd love to wear this dress. Anyway, that's my theory. And finally, just indulge me for a second with a little idea I had when I was putting this episode together. In terms of colour and its application, there was an area where colour was applied that hadn't been applied to for a very long time. The face. Of course, we saw the trendier and more fashionable ladies of the 1910s embracing makeup, but it was in the 1920s that makeup mainstreamed and was worn by an increasing number of females throughout the world. And it occurred to me that not only was the application of makeup a brand new challenge, and if you don't believe me, read the Map and Lucia books by E.F. Benson, who goes into some of the less successful attempts at maquillage in the 1920s, but using colour on the face must have been a challenge too. With this in mind, it's sort of a surprise that the always unforgiving red was a favoured lip colour. I mean, I've worn makeup since I was 14, and I still make a mess when applying red lipstick. Anyway, it made me think just how colourful female faces must have suddenly looked when makeup reached the masses, and how strange it must have been for, I don't know, a child when they saw Mummy for the first time wearing eyeshadow and lipstick, her face suddenly alive with artificial colour. It must have been so confusing, but also kind of cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of History in Colour here on the UFH. You can contact me through my website, amandahallay.com. If you want to comment head over to Facebook. Let's get a bit of a chat going. I'll be back very soon with more episodes here on The Ultimate Fashion History, so just click that little circle down there to subscribe. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching.